Hello and welcome to this edition of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today we are joined by Professor Gisli Gudjonsson, who is the leading academic on the notion of false confessions and their prevalence within the criminal justice system. Over the course of Gisli's career, which he will talk to us about, he has acted as an expert witness in hundreds and hundreds of cases. So Professor Gudjonsson is going to give us some insight into those cases, why false confessions exist, the methods that the police use to elicit confessions that might be false, and just shed some more light on this really topical issue that needs wider public attention. I hope you enjoy.
Good afternoon, Professor Gudjonsson. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
How are you coping with COVID?
I'm coping very well, actually. I'm keeping busy and I'm isolated, but, I've got a good wife and we spend time together. And so, life isn't too bad. You make the most of it, don't you?
You certainly do. That's all we can do right now.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us. I've received some questions from my students, a couple of my colleagues, and from Twitter as well. What we're obviously going to talk about today is false confessions. But before we get started, I wondered, how did you end up working in this field and becoming such a leading light within the field of false confessions?
Yes. I don't think it's chance that I became interested in false confessions. I think it dates back to my work with the Icelandic police, because in 1975 I was working in the Reykjavik CID, Criminal Investigation Police, and I unwittingly elicited a false confession myself.
Okay.
And that was quite interesting and quite shocking to realize how easy it is to elicit a false confession. In a way, it was a false admission rather than a false confession. But what happened is that a woman reported that the previous night she had met a man at a discotheque. They'd gone to her home for a drink, and then he left. And then she discovered that her wallet had gone. And she reported it to the police. I was handed the case to investigate, and I asked the man to come in for interviewing, and he remembered the evening, but not fully, because he was quite intoxicated. And I presented him with the account that the woman had given, that in actual fact, she couldn't find her wallet after he had gone. And he had a history of memory blackouts and petty thieving and so forth. So he accepted her account that he must have done it. He said, I must have done it. I don't remember doing it, and I don't know what happened to the wallet, but I must have done it. And he was prepared to plead guilty to it. So I thought, well, good, that's case solved.
Yeah.
And then not long thereafter, the woman telephoned me, being rather embarrassed, that she had actually found the wallet. It had never been stolen in the first place. And it raised some questions with me because, I asked myself, why did not I ascertain with certainty that the wallet wasn't in the house? I just assumed she was reporting it stolen, and I didn't question her about it. It means that one really has to be very critical. So that was the first experience. And then in 1976, I was working again in the police in Reykjavik when there was a major investigation into two alleged murders. There was disappearance of two men in 1974, and they're called the Guðmundur and Geirfinnur cases, and they're on the BBC website as the Reykjavik Confessions. There have been 4 books written on the cases. And basically, the cases involved 6 people eventually being convicted, 4 of manslaughter in relation to these 2 men, 1 in terms of interfering with the crime scene, and the 4th for perjury, and also 2 of the other men were also convicted of perjury. So this case was being investigated whilst I was in the police, and I met 4 of the 5 people at the time, and I knew the surroundings. I wasn't a part of the investigation, but I was on the periphery. I knew where they were kept in custody in solitary confinement, and they were kept in solitary confinement, for a long time.
Yeah.
And up to 2 years in some instances. And they were being interrogated during that period of time, and some were interrogated for several hundred hours, or 200 or 300 hours.
Right.
And it was all happening, under my noses. And I met these people, and I assumed they were guilty because the police were absolutely convinced they were guilty. The prosecution was absolutely convinced they were guilty. The judiciary seemed to think they were all guilty, and it was like, a case solved. So at the time, I thought, as everybody else in the police, they must have got the right people. And then I didn't really do anything. These people were convicted, and I then went to study in England. In fact, I was studying whilst I was in the police part-time. Then I didn't really think much about the cases, but certainly the case in 1975 was with me, and made me realize that when people are uncertain about their memories, they can be manipulated and made to believe that they committed a crime of which they're innocent. And as a result of that, in 1980, I started working at the Institute of Psychiatry, which is a part of London University at the time, and it's now King's College London. And I met a psychiatrist called James McKeith, and I was telling him about this Icelandic case. In actual fact, he had 2 similar cases. And we decided to present our findings at a conference in Sweden. And then we developed this concept called the memory distrust syndrome. And that really involved people becoming so profoundly distrustful of their own memory that they can become easily manipulated by the police to believe and then think that they've actually committed a serious crime of which they're completely innocent.
Yeah.
So this concept developed really out of my experience in Iceland. That was my first interest in false confessions. And then in 2011, I was asked by the Minister of the Interior in Iceland if I would like to assist with the case, because they were going to reopen the case and review it. And the background to that is that shortly before I was asked, within a week before, I had appeared on Icelandic television, having read 300 pages of a personal diary of one of the people who was convicted, but was now by that time dead, but his daughter had the diaries. And she brought the diaries with her to England with the journalist who interviewed me about the diaries. And once I'd read the diaries, and they were contemporaneous diaries from the period that this man was in solitary confinement and being manipulated, coerced by the police. And I stated on television that in view of these diaries, I believe the cases, both the Guðmundur and the Geirfinnur cases, should be reopened. And as a result, within a few days, the Ministry of the Interior asked me if I was prepared to be a consultant on the review in the review of the cases. And I was a bit reluctant at first because I'd never envisaged I would become involved in the cases, because I'd been a police officer. And some people might say there was a conflict of interest, because at the time I had accepted the police view that they were guilty. And and then I said that I would only do it if all the people involved, the four people who were still alive and their relatives of the other two, were happy for me to actually do it. And I promised that I would do a very objective and dispassionate account, and I would look at the case with an open mind. And that's what I did. And when I looked at the case with a review committee, or it wasn't a review committee, it was a working group. The more I looked into the case, the more concerned I became about the validity of the confessions these people had made. They were so profoundly flawed, in my view, that I thought that that one couldn't really rely on these to convict people, because there is no other evidence. And 5 of these people had developed a memory distrust syndrome and started confabulating, believing that they actually committed the offense. And one of them, actually, to this day, is anxious that perhaps his memory would come back and he had witnessed something about the murder of one of the men. And he was very reluctant to speak to anybody, because he had this dreadful thought that maybe something did happen, even though he couldn't remember it. And he allowed me to interview him. He did not allow anybody else to interview him. He completely trusted me. And it was the trust of these people in me. I'd met, as I said, 5 of these people at the time when I was in the police. But what really was so enlightening is that they trusted my integrity. They trusted I would get to the truth. So I took on the case. But it was an emotional conflict, and because I'd known the police officers and I'd known them as good colleagues. I knew some of the judges, and I knew the prosecutor, and I knew the circumstances. I knew the environment. So in a way, maybe someone else more independent should have taken on the case. But the problem was that I could not think of anybody who could do it apart from me, because I had sufficient knowledge about false confessions to understand what had been going on. And also I knew the background. I knew the facilities. I knew the police. So I had an intimate knowledge that no other psychologist would have had. And also I spoke the Icelandic language. I was able to read all their documents. And the case was complex, incredibly complex. It's probably the most complex case I've ever done. It was complex because no bodies were ever found. It was complex because they were all over the place, the confessions, and also witnesses were made to confabulate in order to help corroborate these people. And the government brought in a German ex-police commissioner to help to coordinate the confessions and ensure that they would be sufficient for the case to lead to a conviction in court. So it's an interesting and a difficult case, and emotionally it was the most difficult case I've ever done, because I felt in a way I was attacking myself. I was criticizing them, but in a way I was there. I didn't see what was going on. I didn't know exactly what was going on, and I had this guilt presumption. But I did it, and it was a hard-fought battle, because I knew the Icelandic establishment would never agree to open these cases unless they were forced to. Because the Icelandic establishment and the Supreme Court, they were not known for admitting mistakes. And there were judges in Iceland who had a conviction rate of 99.4%, you know, that they were judges who were convicting almost everybody who came before them. And so I didn't really have any confidence in the establishment that they would admit mistakes, because I'd learned through the years that there was huge resistance. So I knew I had a battle on my hands, and I fought like a lion because I knew I had to get to the truth, because once I realized the case was fundamentally flawed, there was no turning back. You had to see it through. And this is what I'm seeing in cases. Like you see the case of making a murderer. You know, these two people who've been convicted. You see how hard it is to fight. You know, and you've got lawyers, tremendous spirit and enthusiasm and intellect dealing with these cases. You need a lot of people. You need good lawyers. You need journalists. You need experts. These cases are not won by one expert. They are won due to the collective effort of a number of people and determination. And it's very important that there is public pressure, because often the establishment will not accept anything unless they're forced to. In the UK, in actual fact, I'm very impressed. I've not seen another country that's been so open-minded, following cases of miscarriages of justice, starting with the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, and learning from their mistakes and wanting to do even better. And I gave evidence in a leading case in 1991, the Tottenham 3, and Enkin Rakib. And after they were he was released, the police came to me and said, could you help us to reinvestigate the case, because we want to get it right. And how often do you get that I was in a way their enemy, because I was the one that led to the case, the conviction being overturned, largely based on psychological evidence. And they came to me afterwards and wanted to do better. So, and I've had quite a lot of good experience in the UK about open-mindedness, that they are humane, they want transparency, they want to improve the system. There are still problems, but the thing is, I don't know any other country that's been so open-minded and willing to learn from their mistakes and improve police interview training and try to reduce and prevent false confessions happening in the first place.
In terms of false confessions, can you explain how they exist? Why would someone confess to something they've not done?
Yes, one of the most interesting things that I've learned is that it is so easy to manipulate people into a false confession. And because you think, you know, nobody will confess to a serious crime of which they're innocent unless they're mentally disordered. And this was the attitude in the UK when I started in the 1980s to work on cases. And I worked on over 500 cases internationally. And that was sort of the attitude at the time. And I started researching false confessions, and I wanted to get proven false confession cases and analyze them. And with my colleague, Dr. McKeith, we found a number of cases. And we found cases of people who weren't mentally disordered, who would confess to a double murder. Just because they were young and just because they had been manipulated, because their police had discovered what they were sensitive to and manipulated their self-esteem or their sense of their own sexuality, and got this man to confess to 2 murders he hadn't committed. Fortunately enough, you know, he wasn't convicted because the real murderer was caught. You know, he was trying to commit another murder. So miscarriages of justice are it's a very serious issue, because not only do the individuals themselves suffer and their lives are often ruined, the people who have spent time being falsely accused and nobody believes them, their families also suffer as a result. And the real murderer, the real offender, gets away with it and may commit other crimes. And so I think getting the right person is so fundamental. If you look at, you know, there's different psychological types of false confessions, you know, Sol Kassin and Reitzman in 1985 produced an interesting book chapter on 3 types of false confessions, which I think are important. People have wanted to refine them and criticize them, but actually they are pretty good in relation to the fundamental types of false confessions, which are the voluntary false confessions, where people confess to a serious crime because of notoriety, or because they are confused about reality and, you know, and not knowing whether they did the crime or not. Sometimes it can be elicited by a dream. I've done a couple of cases like that where dreams were quite powerful in leading to false confessions. So you get these, and then you get with voluntary false confessions. You do get, in actual fact, the voluntary false confessions, which are most common and most neglected, are young people taking a case for their mate, or a family member taking a case for another family member. And these cases are often not recounted because people are quite happy to take on a case for their mate, or a wife takes on a case for her husband in terms of speeding or something, or a road traffic accident, or so forth. So in actual fact, there are these cases that are not normally highlighted. So that's the background. And in our research, we've done, I've done, myself and my colleagues in Iceland have done a number of studies to show, when we look at tens of thousands of young people, and we looked at people in different countries in Europe, that if you look at the proportion that false confess, that they tend to be, if you look at those interrogated, there might be 20% of young people who are interrogated, approximately. And then it depends on the age, because the older you are, the more likely to be interrogated. But the younger you are, the higher the proportion that report the false confessions. And what we found in a large study in Europe, in different countries in Europe, was that about 13%, 1-3, of those who had been interrogated by the police reported that they had made a false confession. So it looks like false confessions, particularly to minor crimes, are common and they're kind of overlooked. What we are biased by is these cases, serious cases of murder or sexual offences, where false confessions like DNA, you know, you've got to have some contact in order to have DNA. You know, are you lucky enough to have DNA to prove you didn't actually do it? And I worked on cases, in actual fact, which is good, where I have analysed in detail the confessions and circumstances of the confessions, and I've done that in detail, and then been able to come up with some kind of an explanation about what's happened. So you got, first of all, we talked about the voluntary false confessions. And there are people who are mentally disordered, who confess to very serious crimes for the sake of notoriety. Then we have the coerced compliant type, where people basically can't cope with the pressure and stress of the interrogation. And they basically cave in to the pressure because they want to get out of the police station as quickly as possible and for the interview to be terminated. The third psychological type, this is the coerced internalized, which I believe is the most interesting one, where people confess to something they didn't actually do, believing that committed a particular crime. And this can happen if you look at, it doesn't always have to be coerced, because sometimes a dream can elicit a false confession, or people can persuade themselves due to some circumstances. But generally speaking, these are coerced confessions where the police challenge people's alibi, they challenge their account to events, and they persuade people that because of memory problems or some psychological problems, they have basically suppressed the memory of what they actually did, and then get the confession that may lead to a conviction. And if you look at the proportion, nobody really knows exactly the proportion of different times of false confessions. But in one study, we found that 14% involved this internalized type. And cases that I worked on in the UK where convictions have been overturned, the figure is about the same or similar, 10 to 14%, something like that. So the most common cases that come before the courts and the court of appeal are those that have been coerced by the police, called the compliant type. But you do get sometimes those cases where people genuinely believe they did it, and they may or may not have a memory. It's more a belief, and you manipulate the belief and people just accept it and then give an account of it. And that can lead to wrongful convictions. And sometimes you got to look at how does that confusional state where they believe they did something that they can't remember, how long does it last? In my experience and the basis of our research, in most instances, it's short-lived. It's hours or days, because once they're out of that stressful environment, they start to think, no, I didn't actually do that, and so forth. And they start looking at documents, realizing that there was no evidence against them. But in some instances, like in the cases in Iceland, the Reykjavik Confessions, they lasted for years because of the severity of the solitary confinement, the duration of the solitary confinement, and the intensity and number of interrogations led people to be so confused, profoundly confused, that it took them years to realize they had nothing to do with these crimes. And as I said, in one case, of a man called Albert, to this day, he is worried that perhaps he's buried something, he was a witness to something, and so forth. So what I'm saying is that when the circumstances are extreme, then the lasting effect on the memory can be, long-standing.
Thank you. And this kind of ties in with what you've just said. We've got a question from Wolf Ryan who asks, do you believe people confess due to false memories or deluded belief, or because they just want the process to be over? So I suppose that fits in with the three types here.
Yes, I think that most people confess because they are at the police station, they're out of their depth, they don't have a lawyer, they don't know how to cope, and they're innocent. If they're innocent, they often have this naivety that they don't need a lawyer, and that once they're out of the police station, their lawyer will sort it all out. And I've seen so many cases over and over again where people have told me, I didn't think the police would believe it because once they investigate the case, they realize I didn't do it. Or I thought my lawyer would sort it out. I didn't think I needed a lawyer because I was innocent. God, if you're innocent, you really need a lawyer.
Yeah. And do you think legal representation in the police station is the most effective way to counter false confessions?
No, I think there's a whole variety of things.
Okay.
I think, first of all, you need to ensure that the interviewing technique that's used is in actual fact not likely to result in false confession. So if you are open-minded and there is transparency and you have humanity and you have accountability, then that reduces the likelihood that the police interviewing leads to a false confession due to manipulation and coercion. So I think it's terribly important as a protection that. And then recording, you've got to deal with the interviewing. You've got to get the interviewing strategy right to reduce the risk of false confession. And the UK has been pretty good at this. Now, then you have to have electronic recording of all police interviews. It's terribly important that in actual fact, everything is recorded, electronically recorded, the first interrogation till the last. And then you have to make sure that people are not being questioned or taken on car journeys in between interviews and pressure to confess, because when the police started recording interviews in the 1980s, in 1986 or in late 1980s in the UK, sometimes the police compensated by taking them out on car journeys and then pressurizing them on a journey, taking them to a crime scene or whatever. That mustn't happen. And then you've got to educate the police. You've got to educate the police about the risk of false confession, that false confession is a reality and it can happen to normal individuals. You don't have to have a very young age or mental disorder, even though these obviously are high risk factors. But in actual fact, circumstances can lead to a false confession. And then you've got to have, these are all risk factors. So basically you got in the interview, you've got to make sure that you've got proper interviewing, proper recording, police are well informed about the risk. You've got to make sure that people have an appropriate adult, if they need it, if because of age, if they're below the age of 18, or if they're mentally disturbed, they should have an appropriate adult who further communications and gives advice and basically ensures things are conducted properly and fairly. These and a lawyer as well. So that's a protection at the police station. So there's a lot you can do to reduce the risk of false confession, and prevention is much better than trying to deal with false confessions once people have been convicted, because then they've gone through so much cumulative disadvantage that everything seems to be against them. So it's very, because everything gets contaminated. Once you give a false confession, the police have got a false confession, everything else gets contaminated, even witnesses' accounts, forensic scientists' account, it contaminates the whole system and the whole process. So it's terribly important to get it right. And I really believe in prevention. Prevent it because the cost is so enormous. The financial cost, the human cost, cost of lives. Lives matter. And when people are being questioned at the police station, it is important that they're treated with humanity. It doesn't matter what the police suspect they did. Treat them with respect. You treat them humanely. It's terribly important that you do that. And in fact, there have been cases where people were quite prepared to confess, but because the police treated them, in a way they didn't like, they didn't confess, even though they would have confessed if the police had not treated them as if they were awful, evil people. So one has to put that aside. All you want is to find the truth. You know, search for the truth and do it compassionately. You could do it objectively. Obviously, you've got to do that objectively, but you have to do it with an open mind. And there has to be transparency. I really think that when police officers are lying to people, like they do in America, they're allowed to lie to people, that is a serious problem, you know, because you can lie about the strength of the evidence. You can, and we know that one factor that makes people confess is the perception of the strength of the evidence. And it's not just because they're guilty. They may think they're going to convict me anyway. They've got all this evidence on me. I don't stand a chance. So I better just may tell them what they want to hear.
Yeah. And in terms of sort of this prevention idea, and you say education for police officers is vital. And are the police inclined to take on this notion that false confessions exist?
Well, that's a very good question. I think in many countries, they're not very prepared to accept it, because it's like the same as polygraph examiners. They think, you know, their technique is 99% effective or something, and the police think that they don't make mistakes. And to get a police officer to admit they made a mistake, that is very rare. You know, the cases of miscarriages of justice I've been involved in, very rarely do the police accept they did something wrong. They would keep on blaming the people themselves rather than accepting that they made the mistake in the first place, and then they start covering it up and lying about it, claiming they can't remember, you know, anything to get these people, you know, stay in prison. So it's terribly important that the police, there's a change in attitudes, that police officers admit if they make mistakes, admit it as soon as they can and try to correct the mistake. I always remember I did a case once in Britain, and I was working for the police doing like a offender profiling for the police, and about another case. And then this police officer told me that he was really worried about a case where there had been a false confession. That he was worried about the confession. He said somebody was convicted for these 2 murders. I'm really worried. I've got concerns because I'm not entirely sure from the questioning that he had actually done it. I've got reservations about it. He didn't know I was actually working on a case at the time. And they went to the Court of Appeal, and the man was acquitted. So there are police officers who have concerns and are willing to express their concerns in the interest of justice, but they're very rare. It seems to be that police officers and prosecutors, you know, they're like dog with a bone, you know, they won't let go. They will move the goalposts, you know, they will do anything to try to convince the authorities that these people are guilty and they did not make a mistake, putting the blame on these people who were wrongfully convicted. And I think that's bad. I think that's bad police practice. Police officers in the UK, I worked closely with the British police in many different areas and on many different cases. And I must say, I am impressed with what I've learned about the British police. You know, I don't know police officers in every country, but the countries I worked in, I think Britain, or okay, the UK, but certainly Britain, England and Wales, and to a certain extent Northern Ireland, they have actually been enlightened. You know, they've been enlightened by cases. They've been able to take on the cases, and they've been able to overturn convictions and learn from them. You know, let's not forget that the result of the Birmingham 6 in 1991 is 30 years. In actual fact, this week it was 30 years since they were acquitted. So in actual fact, when there has been, like in the Confe case in the 1970s, that led to the Police and Criminal Evidence Act.
Yes.
And then there was a Royal Commission. And then there was a second Royal Commission following the Birmingham 6. And these Royal Commissions actually commissioned scientists to produce research. So in actual fact, they were kind of a learning experience. So you can see from cases in the UK that they in actual fact wanted to learn, setting up royal commissions to try to learn from the mistakes made and try to prevent future cases of wrongful convictions. So there has been a willingness to learn in the UK, which I see not so often when I work on cases abroad. So I do cases in the UK, and the British criminal justice system, it's always polite. Usually, you know, I used to get a lot of hostility, or probably people didn't trust the developing science or evolving science of forensic psychology early on. But there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of resistance early on in the 1980s and particularly. And once the Guildford 4 in 89 and the Birmingham 6 in 1991 had been overturned, these convictions were overturned, that opened the gate. And then there was the case of Enkin Rakip in 1991. So there was a series of cases where the science actually evolved. And in actual fact, I've got a very interesting story about how the science evolved in terms of psychological evidence in the case of Enkin Rakip. Because in 1988, Rakip went to the Court of Appeal because I had evaluated him and found him to be suggestible and abnormally suggestible, abnormal compliant. But a psychologist that had assessed him the year before had not found him, that was pre-trial, had not found him suggestible, except within the normal limit. So he was kind of average on suggestibility. When I tested him about a year later, he was extremely suggestible, abnormally suggestible on 2 separate tests. The case went before Lord Lane in the Court of Appeal, and Lord Lane didn't like the psychological evidence because he thought it was contradictory. On the one hand, you got one psychologist saying he's just average in terms of suggestibility, and then you've got Gudjonsson coming here and saying he's abnormally suggestible. And he refused to accept the appeal. And then I thought, you know, I'm not prepared to give up. I want to find an explanation for why there was this discrepancy, because I had confidence in my findings. I was absolutely convinced that Rakip was psychologically vulnerable in terms of suggestibility and compliance. And Rakip had told me that he had not trusted the psychologist. He was suspicious of the psychologist. So I contacted the psychologist, and he told me that he was right, that Enkin Rakip had been rather suspicious of him. I then contacted research to look at the effects of suspiciousness and anger on suggestibility, and found that anger and suspiciousness temporarily reduces suggestibility. So if you're tested when you're angry and when you're suspicious of that can reduce suggestibility. And I published a paper in 1989. And that paper was used by the Home Secretary to refer the case back to the Court of Appeal. And as we know now, the expert evidence on suggestibility and compliance was accepted. And the conviction was quashed. So it just shows you that you can do an evaluation, and if I hadn't followed it up and done the research to demonstrate what had caused the discrepancy, the convictions might never have been, or Enkin's conviction might never have been overturned.
Right.
It just shows you that science is evolving, that it's understanding things. And that's what have been all about, is that I am an academic, I'm a researcher, but I'm a clinician. I'm a forensic psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist. And in actual fact, I was using all that. I was using case studies to learn from them. So every case I did and every patient I saw, I looked at and said, what have I learned? What ideas have I got that I can now research? And I got a lot of ideas for research from actual criminal cases. I started developing the tests of suggestibility and the compliance test as a result of cases. I did a lot of research on cases. Then these instruments were then researched and validated and are now commonly used in practice. So it's terribly important to link the case studies with research, and you've got to keep on with research. You've got to demonstrate the validity of what you're doing. So the strength that I had was that I was a clinician, but I was also a scientist. There was the combination of my university post at London University as an academic and a researcher and a clinician that actually helped me to evolve the science of forensic psychology in relation to disputed confessions.
We've touched on some of your cases previously, but what's the gravest example of a false confession that you've seen in your career? Would that be the Reykjavik case?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say that the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, they were tough cases. I mean, I felt like we were walking up a big hill and up a big mountain, in fact, and that we might never get there.
Yeah.
And what I learned is that you don't give up. You continue with the case. You know, we were involved in looking at the Guildford 4 and Birmingham 6 for about 3 years, Dr. McKeith and I. And that was those cases were very, very tough. And the cases in America I've done several cases on people on death row. And these cases, you know, people are facing the death penalty because they made a confession that in actual fact may be fundamentally flawed or even false. So these are grave cases. So I've done so many grave cases where so much was at stake, people's lives, they could be executed. They would, you know, they'd stay in prison for many, many years. But the Reykjavik Confession is the gravest case from my perspective because of the enormity in terms of the number of interrogations and the number of hours interrogated, and also because of the solitary confinement, which is quite unique to Iceland. This thing that people were always under the threat that if you're a witness, you're a suspect, you know, you could be thrown into a cell and kept there for almost an unlimited number of days or years. And so it was the fear, it was the power that the police had about the threat of solitary confinement. And there was a kind of a sort of rule, thumb-making rule that you could keep them in solitary confinement for up to 2 years, you know, if people didn't cooperate. So there was always this implicit threat or explicit threat, or that people would say, you've been in solitary confinement for 30 days now. If you don't confess, we will lengthen it to another 60 days.
Yeah.
But the important thing about the Icelandic case, and I knew this when I was a police officer, there was an excellent law on police interviewing. The law that dated back to the 1950s was open-minded. It said, as a police officer, you must not lie to a suspect. You have to be open-minded. You have to look at things that support the confession. You have to look at things that in actual fact support innocence, and that people should not be interviewed for more than 6 hours at a time. But that 6 hour limit was a little bit blurred, because it didn't say 6 hours in a day, or whether you could interview for 6 hours and give them a half an hour break and then for another 6 hours. And these people in the Reykjavik Confession cases, the Guðmundur and Geirfinnur cases, they were sometimes interviewed for 10 hours in a day or more. So in actual fact, it was the enormity of what had taken place in a police force that I respected, a police force that I was dedicated to, I'd been a part of, that was painful for me to realize that there was a grave miscarriage of justice there. And it's still going, because the 5 of the people were acquitted in 2018, which was excellent. But the woman who was used and manipulated by the police in the first place, in my view, to implicate people in relation to the disappearance of these 2 men, Guðmundur and Geirfinnur, she still has a conviction for perjury, along with 2 other men who are now dead. But nevertheless, she has not got any compensation. The other 5 and their families have got compensation. She is blamed for having started it all. She is still being blamed by the criminal justice system. And she is trying to get her case reopened, because the Criminal Cases Review Committee or Commission that was set up did not support her appeal against conviction for her perjury. And in actual fact, they should have, because there were good grounds for actually acquitting her of these perjury charges, because there were good grounds, but they didn't seem to be motivated or willing to actually do it. So they did not actually consider the pressure this woman was under. Their excuse was, when she implicated 4 people in the Geirfinnur case, she was not in custody. But they failed to mention that they'd taken this woman to a remand prison for 11 hours, for about 11 hours. Nothing was recorded about the interrogation, and they failed to actually mention that. So the Court Cases Review Commission kind of overlooked it. They also blamed, to undermine my evidence in the case, which was quite crucial, and the evidence of a colleague of mine, another psychologist, they blamed us for a minor error in a working group report, where in a chapter on the confessions, there was a statement in that chapter about the nature of the woman's Erla Bolladóttir's conviction, and it was misrepresented in the chapter. But I didn't write it. My colleague didn't write it, but they were blaming us for it and tried to undermine our evidence in relation to the perjury charge of Erla Bolladóttir. So I think it's quite serious that in actual fact they're still doing it, still fighting, that they are blaming this person for having started this big miscarriage of justice. So she is to carry the burden, and that is not fair. So there is a kind of a resistance in the system that a criminal justice system can compromise because they've got no alternative. but to compromise in some way. And then they leave something to save face. So the police officers are not blamed for having manipulated and caused the miscarriage of justice in the first place. They need a scapegoat. And then the woman, Erla Bodil, gets left with that. So that does not seem fair.
And in terms of what you were saying earlier about the high stakes of the cases you're involved in, how do you deal with that pressure on yourself?
I think that's a very, very good question, because my problem is that I'm always thinking of others, and my weakness is that I don't think enough about myself. I'm always trying to look after other people, my colleagues or you know, friends and family and so forth, but I'm not very good at looking after myself. And also when you're dealing with these big cases and there's enormous pressure and you never know the risk, you know, I've traveled to many countries and you never know what's going to happen whilst you're away. And the most difficult cases are abroad when you don't know the circumstances. Some of the cases I was dealing with in Northern Ireland, you know, in the 1990s, you know, it's very stressful cases, and you never know because you are rattling feathers. You know, you are, the establishment does not like what you're saying. So they may do anything they can to try to kind of discredit you or somehow try to undermine you because they see you as a kind of a threat. And in the early 1980s, when I was in the UK, you know, I mean, in one case, I was described as a person of a foreign extraction, you know, because I'd come from Iceland and you know, I was called a Scandinavian in court and so forth. I mean, anything was kind of used in those days. But having said that, the courts in Britain, the lawyers, the barristers are normally respectful. You know, they're not aggressive. In America, when I testified in America, it's much more aggressive. But in Britain, they're polite. They ask, but they're subtle. They're clever. So you can fall into a trap. You've got to be vigilant. But they are normally polite and gentle and get the best out of, you know, the witnesses. So there's a kind of a difference in approach. I like actually and respect British lawyers, you know, barristers. I've had some bad battles, like in the Cardiff 3. I had a battle there and in court. You know, the prosecutor said I was from Cloud Cuckoo Land. You know, and judge reiterated that before the jury that I was from Cloud Cuckoo Land. And in actual fact, I was right. And they were wrong. But they tried to undermine me by using a derogatory term. So what I've learned is that you can expect anything. You can't take anything for granted. You have to be extremely cautious. You know, when you're abroad, you don't go to bars and drink, or you keep to yourself. You don't associate with people because they ask questions and you may be set up and whatever. You have to stay put. It is a lonely game. And being an expert witness, I found, can be very lonely and can be very stressful. And the question is, how do you manage all that stress? You know, does it actually break you? In terms of stress, the Icelandic case has caused me the greatest stress of all because it kind of touched me emotionally in a way, because obviously I was there at the time and I was kind of criticizing the work of my colleagues who I liked and respected. So it was painful. It was emotionally. I got no pleasure from actually working on that case. I did it because I was asked to review the case. I gave it everything. I put everything into it. I did my best. And I just swallowed the pain that was associated with it and so forth. But it has been painful. But justice must be done. You know, you can't leave people wrongfully convicted. You have to keep on fighting. Never give up.
Yeah,
That is my motto.
It's a good
Never
one.
give up.
In terms of the stresses and the pressure, have you ever been threatened?
Yes, I have been threatened.
Yeah.
I've been threatened with murder, and
Why?
you know, I mean, there was one case I was dealing with, and I don't want to name the case, but the police thought there was sufficiently. The threat came from someone else. It came through the BBC. It didn't come through me. But somebody did threaten me, and the police took it seriously, and I was, you know, given good advice. I have been, yes, I have been threatened. You know, you do get threatened, but the thing is, you get also maybe threatened by the people you're seeing.
Yeah.
Because there've been a few occasions where, in actual fact, when I was interviewing people, that they started threatening me, you know, and saying that before I did my report, I should know that they know where I live and gave my home address to me.
Okay.
And I said, that's fine. I'll put all that in your report.
Yeah.
So I put it in the report. I don't know what they did. I don't think that helped them. So there have been things like that, or someone else, like one woman who had been accused of threatening her boyfriend, threatening him and encouraging him to set fire to a flat where they were living to get a bigger flat. And then she came to see me, and she started threatening me with, you know, that because I didn't want to give her her travel expenses, you know, and so she got her boyfriend to try to threaten me, come in and try to beat me up if I didn't do as I was told. And I said, fine, you do whatever you like, but you get prosecuted. I'll make sure of that. You have a go if you like, but there are consequences. And he walked out. He was sensible. But there are a few cases. I mean, there have been a number of cases. I mean, if you say, am I frightened? Yes, of course I'm frightened. Of course I've been frightened. I'm vigilant. You do risk assessments. I've traveled to countries and testified in countries where in actual fact it was, you know, I just didn't know. And you had to be vigilant. You know, you don't always sleep very well when you're under threat, and then you have to perform the following day. But the thing is, once you take on a case, you had to see it through. You can't back down on a case just because you're being threatened. And it's easy to just give in and say, I don't want to do it. So I haven't given in to intimidation or threats or anything. I never given into it. You know, I just carry on. And if people threaten me, the people I'm evaluating, I put it in their report. And that does not help them. And I tell them.
Thank you. Just one final question. And I know you've seen the Netflix show.
Yeah.
I just wondered what your sort of thoughts were on the Brendan Dassey confession.
Yeah. Well, I have not studied it specifically. I've seen the Netflix documentary, which I think is excellent. And I've seen a little bit about the interrogation, and I know that there was no lawyer present, and you've got a 16-year-old boy who has got learning difficulties, and he is interviewed without a lawyer or his parents or an appropriate adult, and he's clearly being manipulated. And the clip I saw in the documentary that clearly shows manipulation, subtle manipulation, is that the officer kind of gently puts his hand on Brendan Dassey's knee. It's like giving him comfort. You know, he's physically touching him on the knee. And that was quite deliberate. And that's a ploy. You know, we are here for you, mate. You know, we are your friends. A little bit of gentle touching. I thought that was very revealing. But that's a tactic they used. So, not having evaluated it, it'd be unfair on me to say it's a false confession because I don't know. I haven't evaluated it. But knowing what I know from the documentary, I can see fundamental problems with the confession.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. And thank you for your time today. An absolutely wonderful chat.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gudjonsson, for such an interesting chat and provided us with such detail about your career and the cases you have dealt with. I'm sure our audience would find that extremely interesting. So thanks again for coming on the show. I would like to thank once again our supporters who help with donations to the show. I'd like to thank Joe Doherty, Donna Jenkins, Lucy Green, Claire Malone, Ian Robbins, Elise Goff, and one anonymous donor as well. So thank you very much for that. I hope you enjoyed the show and join us next time. Thank you very much.